Good morning, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and welcome to another bookish breakfast. Because this is what happens when it's Jane Austen July. You suddenly get 3 videos from me in a week because I'm just so excited about it being Jane Austen July and all of the wonderful Janish things that there are to talk about. So I had a pretty good start to Jane Austen July yesterday. I watched the film of Northanger Abbey. I started reading Northanger Abbey, made a little video about Northanger Abbey. If you haven't seen it, I will try to link it below sometime when I'm slightly less tired because I've just finished a night shift. And I started the audiobook of The Mysteries of Udolpho, so really diving in on all levels. And I also started reading John Mullen's What Matters in Jane Austen, which is fascinating, frankly, which I knew that it would be because everyone had spoken so highly about it. So I was reading this last night on my break in my night shift, and I was reading these chapters that he has where he's talking about sort of sisterly affection and sisterly love and sisters who live together, basically. And what I found quite weird, and I don't know whether it's because he's going to cover it in a later chapter, so I thought I'll say my thoughts about it now just in case he does, so that I've formed my opinions before I've read his. What I think is weird is that he sometimes seems to act as though those relationships will end upon the marriage of one of the sisters, when in fact the role of the relationship between married and unmarried sisters comes into play in a lot of Jane Austen's books. So I grabbed the only thing that was lying by, which was a hand towel. I wrote down my thoughts, and I am now going to recite them to you, and I hope that it's all right. And Luna has decided to join us again. I'll just say hello. No, she was not a fan of that. Yeah. Oh, now I've dropped my notes. Smooth. Right. So, I'm going to be talking about themes from across a number of Jane Austen's books. So, principally, I'm going to be talking about Mansfield Park and Pride and Prejudice because this theme comes up most in those two for whatever reason. I'm not going to be talking about Sense and Sensibility. So, if you haven't read Sense and Sensibility, you are okay here. And I'm also going to be making passing mentions of Emma. And Persuasion. And I think Northanger Abbey isn't mentioned as well. So Northanger Abbey and Sense and Sensibility, you're good. Emma, little details. Persuasion, little details. Pride and Prejudice and Mansfield Park, definite spoilers. But you're here and it's Jane Austen July, so I'm assuming that you've read a decent number of Jane Austen's books. So essentially what I thought of at first was that the presence of a married sister is a massive advantage to the unmarried sister. We've got Mrs. Bennet's famous quote where she talks about how Jane's marriage to Mr. Bingley will throw the girls into the paths of other rich men, and everyone's a little bit embarrassed, but it's entirely true. And we do see that coming into play. For instance, Maria Lucas goes to stay with her sister Charlotte at Mansfield Park parsonage. She doesn't exactly meet tons of other rich men, but she does have the opportunity to meet Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy again on a more intimate footing. It's not her fault that Elizabeth Bennet is also there to kind of like steal the glory. I don't think either of them would have fallen for Maria Lucas anyway, but it's possible that in future when she goes to visit her sister Charlotte, she will meet some other eligible young bachelors in the vicinity of Hunsford. We also see that coming into play with Kitty Bennet, where she gets to go and like live with Jane and Elizabeth quite a lot of the time after Pride and Prejudice ends. And this is not just about meeting other young men, it's also about entering into other spheres of society, meeting other acquaintances. For instance, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, which Maria Lucas is pretty pleased to do. And also for Kitty Bennet, it's about the kind of moral environment that she is brought into. When she goes to spend more time with Jane and Elizabeth, she actually enters into a moral environment that is more fulfilling for her than her home life has previously been. She suddenly has a new sphere in which to develop new hobbies and new thought patterns, and she's taken away from some of the negative influences and the kind of stultifying effect of her whole previous home life. So you can see this as a real opportunity for a young unmarried woman in Jane Austen's time period and for the characters in her novels. I don't think this is a one-way track agreement. I think that this is like a highly mutually beneficial deal for the sisters. So the newlywed young woman has the benefit of having somebody familiar around. You can imagine that many Jane Austen heroines have quite a strong affection for their sisters, and even though maybe Jane and Elizabeth, Kitty's not their favourite sister, it definitely seems to even strengthen the bond between them that she comes to live with them so much after she is married. After they are married, sorry. remember which characters are married and which characters are not. There is also, sorry, the cat is getting in the way of the notes. So there's the familiarity, there's the company, and there's the kind of mutual support that the sisters will get from one another. And there is also a kind of like a social element to it, where the sister has the married sister has just gone into a new kind of, has just acquired a new status, essentially. And by having a younger unmarried sister around, she gets to act on that. She gets to be the chaperone. She gets to be at the head as they go into the dinner room and so on, and she gets to kind of like live all those little details that maybe kind of add a little bit of a glow to her married life, particularly if her husband is maybe not entirely perfect. I'm thinking particularly of Charlotte Lucas here. It talks about how she's kind of proud of her poultry, and I get that some of the pride in that is like, pride is something that happens when you have something to kind of show that to, and having her sister and obviously her friend as well, and friends do also stay with married and unmarried friends, but that was just a complicated thing that I didn't want to think about. Having a sister around allows her to kind of show that off and like revel in the dignities of her new situation. So yes, there's some strong positives for the married partner as well. In this kind of like quite positive, quite happy arrangement that we're seeing, specifically for like Kitty and Maria going to stay with Charlotte, Jane and Elizabeth. So Pride and Prejudice is a very good example book of how this can work really well. So even where the sister relationship is imperfect, it can still confer mutual benefits on all of the parties when the unmarried sister goes to live with the married sister. So I've got two examples of this from the different novels. The main one is Anne Elliot in Persuasion. She is faced with the very unhappy choice of having to leave her home that she's grown up in, and she's got two establishments that she can go and join. And both of them are able to offer her a semblance of a home. And one of them is to go to Bath, a city which she doesn't like, with her dad, who is not bothered about whether or not she's there, and her sister, who is actively discouraging her from coming and showing preferences for somebody else. And one of them is with a sister who is actually really keen to see her. And even though they have a really weird sisterly relationship wherein Mary is very dependent on Anne and very needy and really not always that pleasant to be around, there is still a positive for each of them out of that situation, where Mary gets the support from Anne, and Anne gets a home that she wouldn't otherwise have had, and she gets to enjoy a little bit more time close to the environment of Kellynch, 3 miles away. And like a more of a gradual transition towards moving to Bath. And even when she goes to Bath, she knows that the option of going back to Uppercross still remains sometime in the future. So she knows that she's not shut into that life. And I think that's really, really important, is just knowing that there is another option for you, because you have that married sister who can act as that crucial social support and other establishment for you. This really comes into play for another character, Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park. So Mary Crawford is living with her uncle, the Admiral, when he allows his mistress to move into the house, which is pretty scandalous behaviour. And even Mary Crawford finds it just a little bit too immoral for her and is forced to move out. Fortunately for her, she has a married sister in Mrs. Grant, so she goes to live with her. Obviously, this is a massive drawback for Mary, in terms of her style of life. It's a massive scaling down. She's used to living in London, she's used to being the centre of things, she's used to society and attention, she's used to, people listening to her playing the harp, and then she's got to come to this tiny little country parsonage. But it has benefits in that she is with her sister, who she does care about, and she's a woman who does care about people, despite being, of questionable disposition at times. She does have a very affectionate heart. I think that is clear in the novel. And she gets to be away from these immoral influences of the admirals. For Mrs. Grant, it's positive because we get the sense that her and Dr. Grant don't really have a huge amount in common, and having a sister there means that she really has that companionship that she's perhaps been lacking, and a little bit of variety in her life. And she gets invited more into the society of the neighbourhood because she has this young sister that she gets to take on that role of taking her out and about and introducing her to people. One sister relationship that I just wanted to mention, but I don't really know how it fits in, is Emma Woodhouse and Isabella, who is then Isabella Knightley, because she is married to the younger Mr. Knightley. So as far as I can remember, Emma never actually goes to visit Isabella in her house in London. I'm not sure why that is. I think it's either a marker of the fact that their relationship is always quite distant and never particularly close, and they have very different dispositions as sisters. But I think another factor in that is just that Emma's father is just so totally dependent on her, and he really, really needs her there. I think in many ways Miss Taylor is more of a sister to Emma than Isabella is, so it's almost like she has Mrs. Weston close by acting as that married sister, even though she was a governess, so she never needs to go and like stay in another household. She also has the advantage of never really needing an alternative household. She has a like safe, sound establishment of her own, so she's never in that position where she's needing to think, what are my options if I have to move out of my house? And that's really important in the Jane, Elizabeth and Kitty scenario, is that they know that they won't always have Longbourn. So knowing that Jane and Elizabeth can provide a household for Kitty gives her security and gives her the way that she can think about where she might live in the future, whether or not she manages to get married. The same with Maria Lucas. She always knows that she can fall back on Charlotte having spare space at Hunsford Parsonage. That reminds me of another a benefit to younger sisters, like Kitty and Maria, of going to live with older sisters, is they get to see how a household can be run, and they get to see how their older sister kind of manages expenses and deals with servants, and just learns different styles of living compared to what their parents might have had, and gets to be treated as like an independent young woman who might be maybe partially in control of her own finances. I don't really know how the financial arrangements work, whether if you go and live with your married sister supports you, or whether your parents would still send you money, or just like how it would be arranged. I don't really know that, but if you do, please let me know. I'd imagine in a situation with Jane and Elizabeth where they both have plenty of money, that wouldn't really be an issue. They would obviously be happy to support Kitty, but Charlotte Lucas has got a much smaller budget, so I don't know how that really would affect how long Maria is able to stay and things like that. So there are other situations in which the relationships between married and unmarried sisters are slightly less wholesome. So I believe the first example that I have of this is Mrs. Elton. I think she was at her sister's house when she met Mr. Elton. So when she was Miss Augusta Hawkins, and she was staying with her sister, the Miss Sucklings or something like that, married in a fine house that she can never shut up about. And I think that's not a positive influence, because I think Mrs. Elton would always have been the kind of character who got married for the wrong reasons, if that makes sense. Like she thinks she's very admired by Mr. Elton, and she thinks she's going to like go and set herself up as the person in charge of a small village. But I do think that potentially the influence of being in her sister's house in a public place might have precipitated that marriage a little bit, and maybe facilitated it as well. Maybe if she had been living with her parents, things might have been a little bit slowed. That is one example. Then, of course, we also have Lydia's threat. I'm going to call it a threat, that if her sisters come and visit her when she is married, she will find them all husbands like she found her own. Obviously, that is something that we are supposed to be seeing as quite morally questionable, given her manner of finding her own husband. But the ultimate example of this is Maria and Julia Bertram. So when Maria Bertram initially gets married, she is very, very keen for her sister Julia to come with her to her new household in London, because she frankly can't stand the idea of being on her own with Mr. Rushworth for so much time. And she and Julia have traditionally had quite a close relationship, even though Henry Crawford has kind of come between them in many ways. There has always been a good sisterly bond between them. So it seems like the perfect arrangement. Julia will get to be chaperoned around town. Maria will have some company. I've just realised that I keep varying between saying Mariah and Maria. I normally, when I'm reading the book, think of it as Maria Bertram for some reason. I don't know why, but when I'm just thinking of the name, I tend to say Maria. So I'm sorry about that if that's confusing. However, the problem comes when Henry Crawford comes back into the arrangement, and when Maria Bertram's interests stop being specifically related to her husband and her household, and when her moral influence starts to deteriorate and become quite a negative impact on her sister. We actually have the quote, Maria's guilt induced Julia's folly. So when Maria breaks the bonds of matrimony and actually runs off with Mr. Crawford in an adulterous relationship, like one of the worst moral sins that is committed throughout the entirety of Jane Austen's novels. I think it's hard to overstate the severity of this. It's on a par with, not in terms of the people who get hurt by it, but in terms of the censure it acquired at the time. It's on a par with, or even greater than, Willoughby impregnating a young, spoilers for Sense and Sensibility just after I said it was safe. But yeah, it's very, very frowned upon, is Maria's adultery. And her guilt in that kind of drags Julia down with her, because Julia was in this household and she feels like she has to flee, and so she flees and she elopes. So that kind of shows how a married sister can really kind of undo the work of the parents, perhaps. Because Julia, it even says in the book, she wouldn't have done that. She's not really that kind of person. Although she's very close to Maria, she has quite different ideas compared to her, and if she was in her own household with her own morally upstanding and incredibly severe father and her generally well-intentioned younger brother. Younger? I can't remember whether Edmund's older or younger than Julia. Maybe older. Yeah, I don't know. We get the feeling that she just wouldn't have done that. It is entirely because of the influence of her sister. So I talked at the beginning about how having a married sister was maybe a new opportunity and maybe an extra level of freedom for a young woman. But this shows how maybe too much freedom can be a bad thing, and that married sister can also be a mutually damaging arrangement as well as a mutually beneficial one. So I hope this has been in some way interesting and hopefully in some way coherent. If you have spotted any married-unmarried sister pairings in Jane Austen's novels that I have not thought of over the course of my night shift, then please let me know in the comments and let me know how you feel like they fit into the idea of freedom and opportunity and moral support versus morally negative influences. And just any thoughts that you generally have on this would be great, and I'm looking forward to seeing plenty more Jane Austen July content over the course of the month. Thank you very much for watching. Bye!